A millionaire helps a homeless black woman and her white child she finds in the trash. Years later, he was stunned to learn. The street was quiet, save for the occasional scrape of wind tumbling a discarded can down the cracked pavement. The cold bit through Michelle's threadbare jacket, but she hardly noticed anymore. Winter had a way of dulling sensations, freezing everything into survival mode. Hunger, though, that stayed sharp. It gnawed relentlessly, a constant reminder that warmth and fullness were luxuries she hadn't known in days. She adjusted the scarf tightly around her neck and moved toward the alley. Dim yellow light from a flickering street lamp barely illuminated the narrow space between two towering brick buildings. Trash bins lined the walls, some overflowing with black plastic bags, others left wide open to reveal their decaying contents. Michelle's steps faltered as she reached the first bin. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, but the street was empty. She set her pride aside like she always did and leaned into the bin. Her fingers, stiff from the cold, rifled through the top layer of bags. She winced as the sour smell hit her nose. Stale bread, maybe. A half-eaten sandwich if she was lucky. A sound stopped her hand mid-reach. It was faint, barely audible over the rustle of the wind, a cry soft and broken, almost swallowed by the night. Michelle froze, her breath condensing in short puffs as she strained to hear. The sound came again, clearer this time. A baby's cry. She turned toward the far end of the alley, her heart picking up speed. "No," she murmured under her breath. "It can't be." But her feet were already moving. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the next bin. The cry grew louder, insistent, piercing through the cold like a plea. Michelle's chest tightened as she reached out and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled between greasy takeout boxes and rotting scraps, was a baby wrapped in a thin, filthy blanket. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The cold disappeared, the wind faded, and all she could see was the tiny, trembling figure before her. Pale skin, impossibly small hands, and a face scrunched in distress. The baby couldn't have been more than a few days old. Michelle's hands hovered above the child, unsure. She glanced around, half expecting someone to appear, a frantic mother, a careless stranger. But the alley was as empty as ever. She let out a shaky breath and reached in, cradling the baby against her chest. The child's skin was ice cold, his cries weakening, as if even the energy to protest was slipping away. Michelle pulled her jacket tight around him, her body instinctively curling to shield him from the wind. "Shh. It's okay," she whispered, though her voice trembled with doubt. She had no home, no money, not even enough food for herself. Yet here she was, holding a baby that needed everything she couldn't provide. The baby stirred, his cries softening into faint whimpers. Michelle stared at his face, her throat tightening. His pale skin contrasted starkly with her dark hands, a reminder that they couldn't have been more different. Yet, in that moment, none of it mattered. The world could fall away, but she wouldn't let go. "I don't know what your story is," she murmured, her voice low and rough from the cold. "But I know one thing. You're not staying here." The snow began to fall as she stepped out of the alley, flakes catching in her tightly coiled hair and melting against her cheeks. The city stretched out before her, bleak and unforgiving, but she held the baby close and kept walking. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her decision settling in her chest. Yet, with every faltering stride, there was a flicker of something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. She paused under the faint glow of a street lamp, the baby shifting slightly in her arms. His tiny face peeked out from the folds of her jacket, eyes fluttering shut as warmth returned to his fragile body. Michelle brushed a finger gently over his cheek, her calloused touch careful, almost reverent. call you Henry," she said softly, the name forming like a promise. "And I'll protect you, no matter what." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and distant smoke. Michelle adjusted her scarf and continued walking, her silhouette disappearing into the night as the city's first snowfall of the season blanketed the streets. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but for now, it was enough. The park had seen better days. Rust coated the swings, and the benches sagged under years of neglect. The autumn air was sharp, laced with the dry scent of fallen leaves and the distant hint of exhaust from a nearby street. Michelle sat hunched on a bench, Henry curled against her chest, his tiny hands clutching at the worn edges of her jacket. At just 2 years old, the boy had learned silence as survival, his wide eyes taking in the world with the quiet intensity of someone far older. Michelle pulled the thin blanket tighter around him, her fingers stiff from the chill. Hunger gnawed at her, but she kept her focus on Henry, stroking his curls as he drifted between sleep and wakefulness. She whispered to him, little things to fill the silence, about the shapes of clouds, the way the leaves rustled, anything to distract from the ache in her stomach and the weight of the day ahead. "Hold on, baby," she murmured. "Just a little longer." Edward Watkins watched from a distance, his footsteps slowing as he approached the edge of the park. The sight of her had caught him off guard, a woman clearly living on the edge, clutching a child who looked too fragile for the weather. Something about the scene stirred an old, buried ache in his chest, but he shook it off. He wasn't one to get involved in strangers' lives, not anymore. Not after Catherine. He adjusted his coat, more out of habit than necessity, and turned to leave. Then he saw her tilt her head toward the boy, her lips moving in soft, tender words. It wasn't the kind of desperation he had seen before, the frantic edge of someone drowning in their circumstances. This was different. Her touch was steady, her body curved protectively around the boy. Edward stopped walking. Michelle felt the weight of someone's gaze and looked up, her body tensing instinctively. The man was tall, sharply dressed, his coat pristine and expensive. She knew his type, someone who would cross the street to avoid people like her. She tightened her grip on Henry and turned her face away. Edward hesitated. He didn't want to seem intrusive, but something in the way she shielded the boy, how her body hunched but her eyes remained defiant, kept him rooted. Finally he spoke, his voice cautious but steady. "Do you need help?" Michelle's head snapped toward him, her jaw tightening. "We're fine," she said, her tone clipped. Her pride was an armor she wore as tightly as the jacket around her shoulders. Edward nodded but didn't leave. His eyes shifted to Henry, who was now peeking out from beneath the blanket. The boy's pale skin and bright eyes were striking against Michelle's dark features. Something about him looked familiar. Edward couldn't place it, but it tugged at him in a way that felt almost personal. "Are you?" he asked, softer this time. "It's cold and the kid doesn't look fine." Michelle bristled, pulling Henry closer. "We don't need charity." Edward raised his hands, palms out, a gesture of peace. "I wasn't offering charity. Just, help. There's a diner a block from here. You and the kid could use a warm meal." She eyed him warily, weighing her options. She didn't trust men like him, men with smooth voices and lives that didn't leave scars. But Henry's weight against her chest was lighter than it should have been, and the promise of warmth and food wasn't something she could easily dismiss. "What do you want in return?" she asked, her voice hard. "Nothing," Edward said simply. "A meal, that's it." Michelle studied him for a long moment before standing, adjusting Henry in her arms. "Fine," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "But just this once." The diner was quiet, the hum of the heater and the clink of plates filling the space. Michelle kept her focus on Henry as he devoured a small bowl of soup, his hands gripping the spoon with the determination of someone afraid it might be his last meal. Edward watched from across the table, his coffee untouched. "You're good with him," Edward said finally. Michelle glanced up, her eyes narrowing. "He's my son." Edward didn't correct her. He could see the truth in how she looked at the boy, the fierce protectiveness that went beyond blood. "What's his name?" Edward asked. "Henry," she said, her tone softening as she spoke the name. "Henry Jones." Edward repeated the name quietly, letting it roll over his tongue. The boy looked up then, his gaze meeting Edward's for the first time. Something flickered in those eyes, something that sent a jolt through Edward's chest, a familiarity he couldn't explain. The boy blinked, then turned back to his soup. Edward sat back in his chair, his mind swirling with questions he couldn't yet articulate. As they left the diner, Michelle adjusted Henry on her hip, her steps lighter but her guard still up. Edward handed her a card. "If you need anything," he said, "just call." Michelle hesitated, then slipped the card into her pocket, without a word. Edward watched them disappear into the night, the boy's small head resting against her shoulder. He couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. In the falling dusk, Edward stood alone, a faint sense of familiarity lingering like a whisper at the edge of his thoughts. Michelle sat on the edge of the park bench, Henry asleep on her lap, his small face buried against her jacket. The slip of paper Edward had given her days ago was clutched tightly in her hand, the edges worn from where her fingers had traced it over and over. She stared at the number, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like the cold air. For Henry, she told herself, glancing down at his fragile form. His cheeks were hollow, his tiny hands still clutching at her coat even in sleep. Her pride screamed at her to tear the paper apart, but her love for him silenced the thought. She reached into her pocket for an old prepaid phone, its screen scratched and dim. The dial tone buzzed in her ear. She held her breath as the line clicked. "Edward Watkins," came the voice on the other end, calm and professional. Michelle hesitated, her throat tightening. "It's Michelle," she said finally, her voice low, steady. "The woman from the park." There was a pause, long enough to make her second guess the call. "Yes," Edward said, his tone softening. "I remember. Is everything all right?" "No," she admitted, "but I'm not calling for sympathy." She glanced at Henry, her resolve hardening. "I need work. I can clean, cook, whatever you need. All I ask is a place for me and my son to sleep and some food for him. Nothing more." Edward didn't hesitate. "Come by tomorrow," he said. "We'll work something out." The mansion loomed ahead, like a relic from another world. Its stone facade gleamed in the morning light, sharp and polished, a stark contrast to the life Michelle had known. She stood at the edge of the circular driveway, Henry's hand in hers, his small fingers tightening around her own. She took a slow breath, as if the enormity of the building might crush her if she stepped too close. "This is where we live now." Henry's voice was small, almost swallowed by the quiet around them. "For now," Michelle replied, her words deliberate and cautious. She squeezed his hand. "Just for now." Edward appeared at the entrance, framed by the oversized oak doors. His presence seemed to shrink the vastness of the house, though he moved with a casual ease that Michelle envied. He gestured them inside with a small wave, his expression unreadable. "This is home," he said simply, watching their hesitant steps into the grand foyer. His voice was calm, but his eyes lingered on Henry, who gazed around with wide-eyed wonder. "Make yourselves comfortable." The warmth of the interior was almost overwhelming after so many nights in the cold. Michelle adjusted the strap of her worn bag on her shoulder and nodded, her back straight. "Thank you," she said, her tone measured, even though gratitude and wariness warred within her. The first few weeks passed in a blur. Michelle spent her days adjusting to the routines of the mansion. It wasn't the cleaning or the upkeep that unnerved her. Those tasks came naturally after years of scrubbing floors and mending worn clothing. It was the quietness, the stillness that clung to the air like dust, broken only by the faint ticking of an antique clock or the distant murmur of Edward's meetings. Henry, on the other hand, seemed to blossom in the new environment. His laughter echoed through the halls as he explored every corner with the boundless curiosity of a child. The house, so stiff and imposing to Michelle, became a playground for him. He'd pause at the grand staircase to watch his reflection in the polished banister or crouch by the sprawling library shelves, tracing the embossed letters on the spines of books too heavy for him to lift. Edward often found himself observing these moments, unnoticed, from a distance. One evening, as he leaned against the doorframe of the library, he watched Henry flipping through a picture book he'd dragged from the lowest shelf. The boy's small fingers moved with deliberate care, and his lips formed silent words as he mimicked reading. "Curious little guy," Edward said, stepping inside. Henry looked up, startled at first, then grinned. "It's got animals," he said, holding up the book. His voice was bright, unguarded. Edward smiled and crouched beside him, resting an arm on his knee. "You like animals?" Henry nodded enthusiastically. "One day, I'm going to see a lion, a real one." "That's a good dream," Edward said softly. "Lions are strong, brave." "Like you?" Henry asked, tilting his head. Edward froze for a moment, caught off guard by the boy's sincerity. He laughed, though it sounded more like a release of breath. "I'm not so sure about that," he said, "but maybe you'll be the strong one." For Michelle, the transition wasn't as seamless. The mansion's staff, discreet and efficient, had their routines, and fitting into their world was like walking into an unfamiliar dance. Every polished surface and gleaming chandelier felt like a reminder of the distance between where she'd been and where she was now. But every night, when Henry crawled into her lap and whispered about his adventures in the library or the garden, her resolve strengthened. Time passed, and Henry thrived. His cheeks grew rounder, his steps quicker, his laughter louder. Edward began inviting him to join quiet dinners, or watch the occasional sunset from the sprawling balcony overlooking the grounds. Michelle couldn't deny the change in Edward either. His reserved demeanor softened when Henry was near, his laughter returning in small bursts, hesitant at first, but growing bolder. He'd ruffle the boy's hair absent-mindedly as they walked side by side through the garden or stoop to tie his shoelace without a second thought. The mansion no longer felt as quiet. One evening, Edward sat in his study, a glass of scotch forgotten beside him as he leafed through an old photo album. His own childhood stared back at him, a boy with unruly hair and a wide grin, standing beside his father at some long-forgotten event. His gaze drifted between the photo and the memory of Henry's face from earlier that day. The same grin, the same wayward hair. Edward leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing. He tapped his finger against the edge of the album, the thought refusing to leave him. Henry. There was something there, a familiarity he couldn't explain. He closed the album and stared out the window at the moonlit garden. For the first time in years, a quiet, nagging question began to take root in his mind. Edward couldn't shake the feeling. It started as a whisper in his thoughts, a faint unease every time he looked at Henry, and grew louder with every passing day. The boy's laugh, his grin, even the tilt of his head, it all stirred something in Edward that refused to be ignored. Familiarity, connection. But why? One evening, while Henry and Michelle were in the kitchen, the boys' delighted giggles filling the house as Michelle teased him over a glass of milk. Edward sat alone in his study, staring at a photograph of Catherine. It was from years ago, just before they'd been torn apart. Her bright smile and the way her hair curled along her shoulders were seared into his memory. But now, another image pressed against it. Henry's face, mirroring hers in ways that left him breathless. "I need answers," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The next morning, Edward contacted a private investigator, David Miller. He kept his request vague, dig into Catherine's life after they parted, particularly the years after their separation. He avoided mentioning Henry, even as his suspicions burned hotter. If this connection was real, he needed to be sure. Meanwhile, life in the mansion continued. Michelle had settled into a rhythm, her days filled with the mundane tasks of running a household that didn't truly feel hers, yet she found solace in Henry's joy. The boy thrived under Edward's roof, his laughter bouncing off the high ceilings as he darted through the halls. In quieter moments, he'd crawl into Michelle's lap and whisper about his day, his small hands gripping hers tightly as though afraid she might disappear. "You're happy here, aren't you?" Michelle asked one evening, brushing back his curls as he yawned against her shoulder. Henry nodded sleepily. "Yeah, it feels warm." Her chest tightened at his words. Warmth was something she hadn't been able to give him in the years before they met Edward. She kissed the top of his head and held him close, her resolve stronger than ever to stay for as long as Edward would allow. Weeks later, Edward sat across from the investigator in his study. David's folder was thick, and his expression was serious. "I found something," David said, sliding the folder across the desk. "It's, complicated." Edward hesitated, then opened the folder. The first document was a hospital record, Catherine's. The dates aligned perfectly with the time she'd gone silent, the time he'd believed she was abroad for studies. Instead, the records detailed a pregnancy and a birth. Edward's stomach tightened as he flipped to the next page. The investigator spoke, his voice cautious but direct. "She had a son. It appears the child was removed from her care shortly after birth. I traced payments from Catherine's father, Vincent, to a nurse at the hospital. The child was supposed to be the orphanage, but it seems the nurse abandoned the child." Edward's grip on the folder tightened. His voice was low, almost dangerous. "Abandoned?" David nodded. "Reports indicate the child was left in a dumpster near the hospital. A woman found him. No official records exist after that point until recently, and as you guess, that woman is..." Edward's heart pounded as he stared at the papers. Abandoned. The word repeated in his mind, a sharp, cruel echo. Henry, his son, had been discarded like garbage. His hands trembled, the anger and grief twisting inside him like a storm. He thought of Catherine, alone and manipulated by her family. Her child, stolen from her. And he thought of Henry, the boy who now brought light to his quiet home, who had survived what no child should endure. His chest ached at the realization. That night, Edward stood outside Henry's room. The boy was asleep, his small frame curled under the covers, his hair mussed from a day of play. Edward stepped inside quietly and sat on the edge of the bed. He watched Henry's chest rise and fall, the innocence of his sleep a stark contrast to the pain that had brought him here. Edward reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Henry's forehead. His fingers lingered for a moment, trembling with the weight of the truth. Henry stirred slightly, but didn't wake. "I'll protect you," Edward whispered. You'll never have to know what they did to you. Not yet. As he left the room, he paused at the door, glancing back one last time. The boy's resemblance to Catherine was undeniable now, a reminder of all they'd lost and all they'd gained. Edward knew he couldn't hide the truth forever, but for now, it was enough to ensure Henry was safe, loved, and free from the burdens of the past. He closed the door softly behind him, his heart heavy with both love and guilt, knowing the hardest decisions were still ahead. The kitchen was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Michelle stood by the sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing at a plate as if the act alone could distract her from the weight of the day. Behind her, Edward lingered near the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, his face a careful mask of calm. But Michelle could feel the tension radiating off him like heat. "Michelle," he said finally, his voice low. She glanced over her shoulder. His tone was enough to make her put the plate down. "What is it?" Edward hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor before rising to meet hers. "I know the truth about Henry." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Michelle stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. "What truth?" she asked cautiously, her voice guarded. Edward stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's my son." Michelle's breath caught. She turned to face him fully, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" He explained then, slowly, carefully, about the investigation, the hospital records, Catherine, and the cruel betrayal that had left Henry in a dumpster. As he spoke, Michelle's hands shook, her chest tightening with every word. "So all this time," she said, her voice breaking, "he was yours?" Edward nodded. "I didn't know. Not until now." Michelle's gaze dropped to the floor. Her mind raced with images of Henry, his laughter, his tears, the way he clung to her after every nightmare. "Does he know?" "No," Edward said quickly, "and I don't think he should." "Not yet. He's just a child, Michelle. He doesn't need to carry this." Michelle swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she folded them against her chest. "He's been through so much already," she whispered. "If he finds out—" Edward stepped closer, his voice steady, but soft. "That's why I need your help. I don't want to take him from you. You're his mother, in every way that matters. But we need to protect him from the truth, until he's ready." Michelle looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're asking me to keep this from him? To lie to him?" "I'm asking you to give him the chance to grow up without this weighing him down," Edward said firmly. "Together, we can make sure he feels safe and loved. That's all that matters." After a long silence, Michelle nodded, though her heart ached with the enormity of the decision. "Only for him," she said quietly. Edward exhaled, the relief visible on his face. "Thank you." 6 years later, the mansion had grown warmer over the years, its once cold, polished surfaces now alive with the sound of footsteps and laughter. Henry, now 10, darted through the halls with a boundless energy that softened the air. Edward watched from the study window as the boy chased a soccer ball across the lawn, his shouts of triumph echoing like music. The boy had flourished in ways Edward could never have imagined, but the unanswered question still sat heavy in his chest. It was time. That evening Edward sat alone in the living room, his thoughts a storm as he rehearsed the words he needed to say. Michelle entered quietly, sensing the weight in his demeanor. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting beside him. Edward glanced towards the doorway, where Henry's voice still carried faintly from the kitchen. "I need to tell him," he said, his voice firm but tinged with doubt. Michelle froze. "Tell him what?" Edward hesitated, before meeting her gaze. The truth. That I'm his father. Her breath caught. He's just a child, Edward. This could confuse him, hurt him. Edward nodded. I know, but he deserves to know who he is. I won't tell him everything. Not about Vincent or what happened after he was born. He doesn't need that weight. He paused, but he needs to know where he belongs. Michelle said nothing, but her hand rested on Edward's arm, a silent signal of reluctant support. Later that night, Henry sat on the couch, legs swinging idly as he flipped through a comic book. Edward took a deep breath and sat down beside him. Henry, he began, his voice steady but soft. I need to talk to you about something important. Henry lowered the comic, his head tilting in curiosity. Am I in trouble? Edward chuckled lightly, shaking his head. No, not at all. He hesitated, searching for the right words. You know how much I care about you, right? Henry nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. Yeah, you're like my best grown-up friend. Edward smiled at the innocence of the statement. I care about you because, well, because you're not just my friend. Henry, I'm your dad. The words hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar. Henry blinked, his face a mix of confusion and disbelief. What? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. You're my son, Henry. When you were a baby, we were separated. I didn't know where you were, and I couldn't protect you. But then, you came into my life again, and I've loved you as my son ever since. Henry's brow furrowed, his small hands gripping the edges of the couch cushion. But what about Michelle? She's my mum. Edward nodded, his heart aching at the fear in Henry's voice. Michelle will always be your mum. She's the one who kept you safe when I couldn't. She's the reason you're here, now. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm your father. That's a part of who you are, too. Henry stared at him, his thoughts visibly racing. Why didn't you tell me before? Edward's throat tightened. I wanted to wait until you were old enough to understand, and I didn't want you to feel confused or hurt. Henry looked away, his expression unreadable. So, you're my dad, he said slowly, testing the words. Edward leaned forward, his hand resting lightly on Henry's shoulder. Yes, and I'm proud to be. You've grown into an amazing boy, Henry. I'm so proud of you. The boy sat quietly for a long moment, his small frame stiff with the weight of the revelation. Finally, he looked up, his eyes searching Edward's face. Does this mean you're not leaving? Edward's breath caught, the simplicity of the question cutting deeper than any protest or outburst could. He shook his head, his voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, and I always will be. Henry's lips trembled, but he nodded, his body relaxing slightly. Okay, he said, his voice soft. I guess that's okay. Edward reached out, pulling Henry gently into a hug. For a moment, the boy stiffened, but then he leaned into the embrace, his small arms wrapping around Edward's back. As they sat there, the faint hum of the mansion around them, Edward felt the weight of his decision lift slightly. It wasn't everything, and it wasn't easy, but it was enough for now. Later that night, as Edward stood in the doorway of Henry's room, he watched the boy asleep, clutching his favorite stuffed lion. He thought of Catherine, of the life they could have had together with Henry, and the life they had now. Fragmented, but healing. He whispered into the quiet, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. You're safe, Henry, and I'll make sure you always are. For the first time in years, he felt like he had taken a step towards something whole. The auditorium roared with applause, the sound reverberating off the high ceilings like a triumphant echo. Henry stepped onto the stage, his posture confident, but his hands trembling as he reached for the diploma. His name had been called moments earlier, but it still felt surreal. Dr. Henry Watkins. The weight of those words settled over him, equal parts pride and disbelief. In the front row, Edward and Michelle sat side by side. Edward's face was calm, but his eyes glistened, betraying the emotion he so often kept under wraps. Michelle, however, made no attempt to hide her tears. Her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. She watched Henry with a look that could only be described as maternal triumph. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night had led to this moment. As Henry descended the stairs and returned to his seat, he allowed himself a glance toward them. Michelle smiled through her tears, mouthing the words, "I'm proud of you." Edward gave a small nod, his expression warm and steady. The two of them, so different yet so constant, had been his pillars. Later that evening, the dining room in the mansion glowed under the soft light of the chandelier. The table was laden with dishes Michelle had prepared, each one a nod to Henry's favorites: roasted chicken, buttery mashed potatoes, and her signature chocolate pie. Laughter filled the room as they settled into their seats, the air thick with celebration. "To Henry," Edward announced, raising his glass of wine. His voice was steady, but the pride in his tone was unmistakable. "To your hard work, your compassion, and to the incredible life you're about to lead, we couldn't be prouder of you." Henry chuckled awkwardly, lifting his own glass of soda. "Thanks, Dad. But it's all thanks to you and Mom." He glanced at Michelle, his smile softening. The word Mom never failed to catch her off guard, even after all these years. She smiled, brushing her hands on her lap to steady herself. "We just gave you a place to grow," she said quietly. "The rest was all you." Henry's cheeks flushed as they dug into the meal, laughter and conversation flowing freely. But as the evening wore on and the plates began to empty, a contemplative silence settled over him. He glanced at the two people who had shaped his world, a question forming in his mind. "Do you ever wonder where I came from?" he asked suddenly, his voice hesitant but firm. Michelle froze, her fork hovering mid-air. Edward, seated across the table, shot her a brief, unreadable glance before turning his attention to Henry. "What do you mean, son?" Henry shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "I mean, I know you've told me the story. How Mum found me. How you both took me in. And I'm so grateful for that. I couldn't have asked for better parents." His voice softened. "But sometimes I wonder, who were my real parents? Why didn't they want me?" The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Michelle forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat, her fingers tightening around her napkin. She smiled faintly, though her heart ached. "What matters," she said gently, "is that you were always loved. From the moment I found you, Henry, you were mine, and you always will be." Edward nodded, his tone steady. "Michelle's right. You've always been part of this family, Henry. That's what matters most." Henry smiled faintly, but the question lingered in his eyes. The conversation shifted after that, but the weight of his words remained. Years passed, and Henry's dedication to medicine consumed him. He graduated at the top of his class in medical school, and his residency only deepened his passion for helping others. After years of grueling hours and sleepless nights, he earned a coveted position as a surgeon at one of the city's top hospitals. Michelle watched from a distance as Henry built a life for himself. Each milestone brought her immense pride, a pride she didn't often express out loud, but carried in the quiet moments. She'd visit his apartment sometimes, her arms full of homemade meals. Henry always greeted her with a hug, his affection as genuine as ever. Still, beneath her pride was a quiet fear. She had always known the day might come when Henry would dig deeper into his origins. What would he think of her when he learned the truth? Would he still call her Mom with the same tenderness? But for now, Michelle allowed herself to focus on the present. Henry's success, his happiness, his ability to face life with compassion and strength, those were enough. As she left his apartment one evening, watching him wave from the doorway with that same boyish grin, she whispered to herself, "He's my boy, no matter what." And as Henry turned back to his bustling life, a part of him remained anchored in the home and the love that had made him who he was. The questions of his past lingered, but they were tempered by the steady foundation Michelle and Edward had built for him, a foundation he carried with him even as he stepped into his future. Where on earth is the person listening to this story from? Does it snow in your country? If so, leave a comment saying snowman, otherwise write sunshine. Now, we continue. The steady hum of hospital machines filled the room, blending with the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. Henry adjusted the stethoscope around his neck, his face calm, but his thoughts a swirl of focused determination. His shift had been long, routine cases punctuated by moments of chaos. But this patient was different. Seated in the bed was an elderly man, his frail frame swallowed by the crisp white sheets. Vincent Harding. The name on the chart matched the man's pale, weary face. Kidney failure? Late stage. Time was running out. Henry's voice was steady as he explained the next steps, masking his own frustration. "We've matched you to a few potential donors, Mr. Harding, but none are ideal candidates. We'll keep searching." Vincent nodded weakly, his grey eyes clouded with fatigue. "I've made my peace," he said, his voice raspy. "But thank you, Doctor." Something about the man stirred a strange unease in Henry. It wasn't his condition or even the resignation in his voice. It was the familiarity. Henry couldn't place it, but it lingered as he stepped out of the room and into the hallway. A week later, Henry found himself staring at a lab report in disbelief. His own name was listed as a potential donor. He matched Vincent Harding perfectly. The odds were astronomical. Henry leaned back in his chair, his hand running through his hair. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, pulling up additional tests. Further analysis confirmed it. The genetic markers didn't just align for compatibility, they revealed a familial connection. Henry froze, his chest tightening as the realization struck. Vincent Harding wasn't just a patient, he was his grandfather. Henry stared at the ceiling of his apartment that night. The report spread across the coffee table in front of him. Questions circled his mind like a storm. Michelle's voice echoed faintly in his memory. "What matters is that you were always loved." But now, for the first time, it wasn't enough to quiet the curiosity burning within him. He pieced together what little he knew. A mother who abandoned him. A father who stepped into his life later. But where did Vincent fit in? And why had fate thrown them together now, in this sterile hospital setting? Despite the questions clawing at his mind, Henry made a decision. He wouldn't ask Edward or Michelle, at least not yet. He wasn't ready to confront them with the truth, wasn't ready to see their faces shadowed by guilt or pain. Instead, he poured himself into the work, into the immediate problem of saving Vincent's life. Henry approached his next shift with the same calm determination he always carried, but inside, the storm raged on. Days later, as he stood beside Vincent's bed during a routine checkup, Henry found himself studying the man's face. There was something in the slope of his jaw, the sharp angle of his cheekbones, that seemed vaguely familiar. "You're a good doctor," Vincent said, breaking the silence. His voice was weak but sincere. "I've seen enough in my years to know." "Thank you," Henry replied, his tone professional. Vincent's gaze lingered on him, his pale eyes searching. "You remind me of someone," he said softly. "Someone I lost a long time ago." Henry's breath hitched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Who?" "A grandchild," Vincent murmured, his voice growing distant. "A boy I never got to know." Henry's throat tightened, but he said nothing. He simply adjusted the blanket over Vincent's chest and left the room, his heart pounding. That night, Henry sat in his car outside the hospital, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The DNA report was tucked into his bag, its weight pressing against him like a secret he wasn't ready to share. He thought of Edward's steady guidance, of Michelle's unwavering love. They had given him everything, and yet this truth felt like a wedge, threatening to splinter the foundation of his life. For now, he told himself, the questions would remain unanswered. He needed time to piece together what this meant for him, for his family, and for the fragile connection he'd unknowingly discovered. As the city lights blurred through the windshield, Henry leaned back and closed his eyes. The answers were coming. He could feel it. But tonight, the questions were enough. The hospital corridors were unusually quiet for the early evening shift. Henry walked briskly, his white coat swishing behind him, the familiar weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. He was heading toward Vincent Harding's room, ready to review his charts again. The DNA results still lingered at the back of his mind, like an unsolved riddle. As he approached, he noticed someone sitting by Vincent's bedside. A woman, her posture tense, her face turned toward the frail figure in the bed. Henry paused, his footsteps faltering. The woman's auburn hair caught the dim hospital light, sparking a vague familiarity. "Excuse me," Henry said, stepping into the room. The woman turned, and their eyes met. Time seemed to slow. She looked to be in her late 50s, her face lined with years of pain and resilience. Her green eyes, so strikingly similar to his own, widened as they locked onto his. "You must be the doctor," she said, her voice soft but unsteady. Henry nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "I am. Henry Watkins. And you are—" She hesitated, glancing back at Vincent. The old man gave her a faint, knowing nod. She turned back to Henry, her expression guarded but vulnerable. "Catherine," she said, "I'm his daughter." Henry's heart skipped a beat. Catherine. The name. His mother. Minutes later, Edward arrived at the hospital, his presence commanding yet subdued as always. He stopped short when he saw Henry standing stiffly outside Vincent's room, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. "Henry?" Edward asked, concern lacing his voice. Henry turned, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "She's here," he said quietly. "Catherine, she's inside." Edward's face froze, his usual composure slipping for a moment. He stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. "Let's go in." Together they entered the room. Catherine stood near the window, her back to them, gazing out at the city lights. When she turned, her eyes immediately found Edward's. Her breath caught, and for a moment the years seemed to melt away. "Edward," she whispered. "Catherine," he replied, his tone heavy with unspoken memories. Henry cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "I think we need to talk," he said, his voice tight but steady. They moved to a quiet corner of the hospital lounge. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Catherine sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, while Edward leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Henry sat across from them, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Catherine was the first to speak. "I never wanted to leave you," she began, her voice trembling. "You need to know that. I fought for you. But my parents, they made decisions I couldn't stop." Henry's jaw tightened. "Decisions like abandoning me." Tears welled in Catherine's eyes, but she held his gaze. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "They told me you'd been placed in a good home, that you'd have a better life. I believed them because I had no choice." Edward glanced at Henry, then back at Catherine. "You should have fought harder," he said quietly, his tone a mixture of anger and sorrow. Catherine nodded, her tears spilling over. "I should have. But I was young, scared, and trapped under their control." She looked at Henry, her expression raw. "Not a day has passed that I haven't thought about you, wondered if you were happy, safe." Henry's emotions churned, anger warring with an unexpected ache. "And now?" he asked, his voice low. "Now I want to know you," she said, her desperation palpable. "If you'll let me." The room fell into silence. Henry stared at her, his mind racing. He had spent years wondering about the woman who had given him life. Now she was here, and she was nothing like he had imagined. She was broken, remorseful, but undeniably human. Edward broke the silence. "Henry, you don't have to decide anything right now." His voice was calm, steady. "Take the time you need." Henry nodded, his gaze still locked on Catherine. "I need to think," he said finally. He stood, the chair scraping softly against the floor. Catherine looked up at him, hope flickering in her tear-streaked face. "Thank you for listening," she said softly. Henry hesitated, then gave a small nod before leaving the room. That night, Henry sat in his apartment, his head in his hands. The conversation replayed in his mind, every word pulling at his heart. He thought of Edward, who had been a steady presence through every challenge, and Michelle, who had given him the unconditional love of a mother. He reached for his phone and dialed Michelle's number. She answered on the second ring. "Henry," she said, her voice warm with concern. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Of course," she replied. "I'm always here." As he leaned back into the couch, Henry felt a small measure of comfort. Whatever answers he sought, he knew he could face them with Michelle by his side. Henry sat on the worn couch in Michelle's modest apartment, his head in his hands. The room was filled with the warm, familiar scent of lavender, a reminder of the nights she had soothed his childhood fears. Across from him, Michelle watched silently, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face etched with concern. "Henry, talk to me," she said softly. Her voice was gentle, yet it carried a strength that always seemed to ground him. He looked up, his eyes weary. "I don't even know where to start." Michelle leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Then start with what's in your heart." Henry exhaled deeply, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I met her. My biological mother, Catherine. And Vincent, he's my grandfather." He paused, his voice shaking. "She told me she didn't want to abandon me, but it's hard to believe. You know? All my life I've wondered who they were, and now that I know, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't feel real." Michelle's chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "It's a lot to process," she said. "You're allowed to feel confused, angry even." Henry nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I thought knowing would make everything clear, but it's just harder. I don't even know how to feel about her." Michelle reached over, placing a hand on his knee. "Henry, listen to me. Family isn't just about where you came from. It's about love, about the people who stand by you through everything. Her voice softened, filled with emotion. You are my son. From the moment I found you, you became my world. That hasn't changed, and it never will. Henry's throat tightened, a lump of emotion rising as he looked into her eyes. But what if all of this changes how I see you? How I see Edward? Michelle shook her head firmly. Nothing changes, Henry. Not unless you let it. The truth of your past doesn't erase the love you've had or the life you've built. It just adds to it. For a moment, the room was silent, her words sinking in. Henry's shoulders relaxed slightly, the weight of his confusion lifting just enough for him to breathe. I don't know how to forgive her, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Michelle smiled faintly, her hand still on his knee. Forgiveness isn't for her. It's for you. Holding on to anger won't change what happened, but letting go will free you to move forward. It's not easy, and it won't happen overnight, but you'll find your way. Henry swallowed hard, his eyes shimmering. How do you always know what to say? She chuckled softly. I don't always know, but I know you, Henry. I know the man you've become, and I trust you to make the right choices. Henry leaned back against the couch, his head tilting up to rest on the edge. I don't want to lose what we have. You won't, Michelle said firmly. You'll never lose me, no matter what. Her words wrapped around him, like the embrace he hadn't realized he needed. For the first time in weeks, Henry felt a sense of peace. Later, as Henry left her apartment, the cool night air brushed against his face. He glanced back at the door, his heart swelling with gratitude. Michelle's words echoed in his mind, steadying him as he faced the unknown. No matter how complicated the truth became, her love was his anchor. And with that, he knew he could face whatever came next. Later that night, Henry returned to the hospital. The fluorescent lights felt harsher than usual, but he walked with purpose. When he reached Vincent's room, he wasn't surprised to find Catherine sitting beside the bed, her head resting in her hands. She looked up when he entered, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Henry took a seat across from her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment they simply looked at one another. Then quietly he said, I want to know more. Catherine's breath hitched. You do? He nodded. But not everything all at once. I need to take this one step at a time. Relief flooded her face, and she reached out tentatively, her hand hovering near his. That's more than I could have hoped for. Thank you, Henry. He didn't take her hand, but he didn't move away either. We'll see where this goes, he said, his voice calm but firm. As he glanced at Vincent, who was dozing quietly, Henry felt a flicker of understanding. His world had fractured, but it wasn't broken. With Michelle's love anchoring him and the tentative bridge forming with Catherine, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to bring the pieces together. The hospital room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the machines. Vincent lay propped up against a stack of pillows, his face pale and drawn. His frailty was undeniable, a stark contrast to the imposing man Henry imagined he must have once been. Catherine sat beside him, her fingers nervously twisting a handkerchief. Henry stood at the foot of the bed, his hands shoved into his coat pockets, his face carefully neutral. Dad, Catherine said softly, breaking the silence. There's something you need to hear. Vincent's eyes fluttered open, his gaze shifting between his daughter and Henry. He gave a faint nod, his voice barely above a whisper. Go on. Catherine swallowed hard, glancing at Henry for reassurance. When he gave her a small nod, she turned back to Vincent. Henry is your grandson, she said, her voice trembling. He's the child I lost all those years ago." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Vincent's face contorted in confusion, then disbelief. "What are you saying?" he rasped. "I'm saying that he's yours," Catherine continued, tears welling in her eyes. "The child you and Mother, you took him from me. You told me it was for the best, but you lied. And now, after all these years, he's here. He's standing right in front of you." Vincent's breath hitched, his hand clutching at the thin blanket. His gaze shifted to Henry, searching his face for confirmation. Henry stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "It's true," he said evenly. "The DNA tests confirmed it. You're my biological grandfather." For a long moment, Vincent said nothing. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, his eyes darting between Henry and Catherine. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with guilt. I didn't know this would happen. I thought I was protecting our family." "Protecting?" Catherine's voice broke, the years of pain boiling to the surface. "You destroyed it, Dad. You tore us apart. I've spent my whole life grieving a child I thought was lost forever. And Henry, he's had to piece together a life from the brokenness you left behind." Tears streamed down Vincent's face as he shook his head weakly. "I was wrong. So wrong." His voice cracked. I thought I was doing what was best for you, for all of us. But I see now. I see what I've done." Henry stood silent, his emotions swirling, anger, pity, confusion. Finally, he spoke. "You might have thought you were protecting her, but you didn't protect me. You left me in a dumpster. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" Vincent sobbed quietly, his body trembling under the weight of his remorse. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know that Nurse would. I never wanted that for you." Henry clenched his fists, the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "And now you're here, dying, and I'm supposed to just forgive you." Catherine stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Henry, he's not asking for forgiveness. He knows he doesn't deserve it, but he regrets it. Every single day of his life, he's regretted it." Henry looked between them, his emotions swirling. The truth of his origins had shaken him to his core, but the realization of Vincent's pain added a new layer to his conflict. He took a deep breath, forcing his anger aside. "I'm a match," Henry said finally, breaking the silence. "I can donate my kidney. It's the right thing to do." Vincent's eyes widened, and he shook his head vehemently. "No," he said firmly, his voice gaining surprising strength. "You won't do that for me." "I'm a doctor," Henry replied, his tone hard. "I save lives. And whether I like it or not, you're my patient and my grandfather." "You've already given me more than I deserve by being here," Vincent said, his voice softening. "I won't let you sacrifice a part of yourself for someone like me." Catherine stepped closer, her hand resting gently on Vincent's arm. "Dad, please." "No," Vincent interrupted, his voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not worth it. This family needs healing, not more pain. Let me go, Catherine." 2 days later, Vincent's health took a sharp decline. By the time Henry returned to the hospital after a long shift, he was handed a letter instead of a conversation. The nurse on duty explained that Vincent had written it just hours earlier, asking for it to be delivered to Henry after his passing. Henry sat in a quiet corner of the hospital lounge, the sealed envelope trembling in his hands. When he opened it, Vincent's shaky handwriting covered the page. "Henry, I don't have the right to ask anything of you, but I hope you'll read this knowing that I mean every word. I failed you and your mother. I let pride and fear guide my choices, and in doing so, I took away the family we could have had. I'll carry that guilt with me wherever I go next. You have every right to be angry with me, but I see the man you've become, and I am humbled. Despite everything, you've grown into someone strong, compassionate, and better than I ever could have imagined. That's because of the love you've had. Your real family, Michelle and Edward. Hold on to that. They're the ones who saved you in ways I never could. Please don't waste your life carrying the burden of my mistakes. Forgive not for my sake, but for your own peace. And love with the kind of heart you've shown me you already have. Thank you for the chance to know you, even if it came too late. I hope you'll find healing in ways I couldn't. With all my regrets, Vincent Henry folded the letter carefully, his chest tight with a mixture of emotions. At Vincent's funeral a week later, the family stood together in quiet reflection. Catherine clung to Edward's arm, her grief raw but softened by his steady presence. Henry stood slightly apart, his gaze fixed on the modest headstone. Michelle placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You did what you could," she said softly. Henry nodded. "It's just hard to let go." Michelle's voice was firm, yet comforting. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means moving forward, and you've got a lot of life ahead of you. Henry turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks, Mom," she smiled, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Always." As they walked away from the grave, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm light over the family. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough, a beginning to the healing they all desperately needed. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the estate's sprawling gardens. Edward stood on the balcony, his hands resting on the rail as he gazed out over the grounds. His thoughts lingered on the days past, on the loss of Vincent and the weight of his confessions. A soft knock on the door broke his reverie, and he turned to see Catherine standing there. "You're quiet today," she said gently, stepping onto the balcony beside him. Edward smiled faintly. "Just reflecting." Catherine reached for his hand, her touch hesitant but sincere. "I've been doing the same. So much has happened, Edward. So much I wish we could change. But maybe it's not too late to start over." He turned to face her fully, searching her eyes. There was still pain there, but also hope. A fragile thread they could hold on to. "I never stopped loving you," he said simply. Catherine's breath caught, and she smiled, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I never stopped loving you either." The years of separation melted away as they embraced, their shared grief and love binding them together once more. Henry watched them from the edge of the garden, his expression a mix of surprise and quiet acceptance. Michelle stood beside him, her arms crossed as she observed the scene. "They deserve this," she said softly. Henry nodded. "Yeah, they do." He turned to Michelle, his voice lowering. "Are you okay with it?" Michelle looked at him, her smile tinged with sadness but also pride. "Of course I am. Love doesn't take away, it adds. What they have doesn't change what we have, Henry." She placed a hand on his arm. "You'll always be my boy." Henry's chest tightened, and he pulled her into a hug. "Thanks, Mum," he whispered. A few days later, the family gathered at Vincent's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Henry knelt to place a bouquet of white lilies on the headstone. Beside him, Catherine added a single rose. Edward stood behind them, his hands resting on Catherine's shoulders as they bowed their heads in silence. Michelle stayed slightly apart, her gaze thoughtful as she watched the family she had helped build. "Vincent wasn't perfect," Catherine said finally, her voice trembling. "But in the end, he tried to make it right. That has to count for something." Henry nodded, his jaw tight. It does. He glanced at the headstone, his emotions a swirl of forgiveness and sadness. I don't think I'm there yet, but I'm trying. Michelle stepped forward, her voice steady. That's all you can do, Henry. Healing takes time. As they left the cemetery, the atmosphere was lighter, as though a burden had been lifted. Edward and Catherine walked hand in hand, their love rekindled and stronger than before. Henry walked between them and Michelle, his heart filled with a sense of belonging he hadn't fully understood until now. The path ahead wasn't without challenges, but for the first time they faced it together, a family forged through pain and redemption. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground, the family walked toward their car. Henry reached for Michelle's hand, giving it a squeeze. She looked up at him, her smile soft and unwavering. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "For what?" she asked. "For being everything I needed. For being my mom." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she simply nodded. "Always." And as they walked together, united by forgiveness and love, they knew the future would be brighter. The past had shaped them, but it didn't define them. Together, they had found a new beginning. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.